Good afternoon and welcome back to today's workshop. If we were in person, I'd be hoping that you had an enjoyable lunch and exchanged some good ideas with colleagues. Of course, given that we are on a virtual platform, I just hope that you've managed to find some time for lunch and that you haven't got too many crises going on in the background. So today's session third session is another really interesting session that takes the focus up to the regional level. And as Mary said in her opening statement, there's a really strong correlation between skills and human capital with positive regional outcomes. And as such, human capital, I think, will be front and centre of the debates around the levelling up agenda. So we have 3 more papers. And as before, each speaker will have 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes for questions. Please do post any questions in the chat or the questions and answer box. You've been absolutely marvellous so far, so I look forward to hearing some more questions there. The presentations are being recorded and hopefully that's okay with everybody, so just to let you know. So without further ado then, please let me invite Augustin de Coulon from King's College to share his screen and start presenting his work on human capital stocks. I will subtly interrupt when you have about 2 minutes left, Augustin, so I hope that's okay.
All good. 20 minutes and
yeah, I can see your screen and yeah, you're good to go.
Yes, so thanks everyone for attending and thanks for the invite as well and the introduction, Catherine. So feel free to interrupt me anytime, anyone, as I talk. So this is joint work funded by ESCoE with Larissa Marioni and Marioni, and we want to look at regional human capital stocks, and with a few thank yous as well from to Sanjeev, mostly Georgie Vasilev and others as well at the ONS SRS allowed us to get access to the data and having lots of productive interaction. So the context is the focus on using regional capital stock combined with a work-life approach. So the idea is to look at regional stock and try to assess the impact of regional within or internal migration on the evolution of those regional capital stocks. So as I said earlier, this is based on building on work for ESCoE. So the HCS approach is a well-developed framework, as probably everyone in the room is already aware. This was sort of relate to seminal work by Jorgensen and for many dating back probably a few decades now. And this has been supported by the Atkinson report 2005, and then lots of people are lots of governmental statistical organizations in the world are using this approach in the human capital accounts. The ONS has introduced it in the UK since 2016. So what we want to do is to account for the fact that so far there isn't much of taking into account regional mobility. We know regional mobility is happening, is quite prevalent in many developed countries, developing as well. And the sort of the original sort of human capital approach to migration developed by Saskia in the 1950s. Basically, people are looking for greater salaries, greater income, but as well greater job opportunities by moving. More recently, and there are interesting development in this literature that looked at mental health, well-being, how immigration can potentially improve or reduce the individual well-being. There's as well quite a bit of work on finding out why not more people migrate, both internally and internationally. So 43% of the UK population is still living in the place where they were born. Sounds quite a large number, but the interesting thing is that differ enormously by region within the UK as well. So you've got some region where a far greater proportion of the population has never migrated than in others. And I'd just like to mention as well some recent, quite interesting, for exciting lab evidence. So where you look at, you interview students in laboratory experiments and you compare two countries, both countries which are sending a lot of migrants outside of their own, Portugal and Kenya, and they sort of manipulate the sort of condition in the lab to try to find out whether those sort of historical theories relying mostly on economic outcome do explain the intention to migrate. And they do find that actually they fail to account for the risk linked to the migration. When you account for the risk of finding a job in a new place, in the new area, suddenly a lot of those predictions are not valid anymore. So I thought it was an interesting one I wanted to mention here as well. So ideally what we wanted to do, and we probably set up to do in this project, it was to ascertain the full extent and full impact of adding geographical mobility in the UK on the estimates of local human capital stocks. This has not been possible so far, but I mean, we've made some strides towards this aim. So this work is mostly talking about the travel to the end objective of this. So what we've done so far is built regional transition probabilities, both at NOTS 1 and NOTS 2 level. So we know we can't really use those NOTS European Union labeling anymore. They've got a new name now. Can't remember which one. So if you let me just use them for a few more years, hopefully you'll be happy with that. And also NOTS around 10 region, 12, NOTS 1, NOTS 2, 40. So that's definitely larger than local authority, but that's the sort of level aggregation we're using. Then what we do as well is that we try to correlate those transition probabilities, both at NOTS 1 and NOTS 2 level, with relative wages in those regions and different groups. So we group, we differentiate between male and female, and we differentiate between 3 levels of skills and 3 age group as well. And then we resort to, we don't do what we basically the first bullet point is, but what we do instead is resorting to simulation to get a handle on an idea of how transition probabilities can affect potentially a regional human capital stocks. Right. So if we haven't got the time or the space to show the many tables that we produce, although mostly Larissa produce. But let me show two here where we've got the top 10 groups moving to, so that would be the sort of host region, as calculated using the NUTS 2 regional decomposition. So that would be the top one would be people who move to the east of England with high qualification, younger one, and being male. And we accumulate this probability of moving over 5 years. I think I've got 9, it's an older version there. And we get this average probability of moving. And we do that for the approximately 198 different group. We do the same for average probability of moving, but this time from. So that's the sort of the source regional grouping. So for example, the top one here would be male, young male with high qualification living in Wales, where the sort of the origin country is the top top figure there. So we do that for NUTS 1, the NUTS 2, and then we try to, so we end up with 188 group for NUTS 1 and 640 for NUTS 6. And then what we do for this is that we aggregate the to and the from to get a sort of a net transition for each group. So some will have, of course, negative value, and some others will have positive values, and will be between -1 and +1. And then we do a regression or correlational analysis where we look at the probability of moving to region R for group G at time T. And we try to explain that by the log wedge of region G, region R, and time T. And then we differentiate that by the time measured, so time dummy. And then we sort of give fixed effect for group belonging, and then the region as well. And so we have another large set of analysis there. So we sort of try to summarize it in 3 bullet points. Not so easy, but what's quite obvious is that the wedges are never significant in our regression, which we found quite interesting result. There are some significant effects for female, for older, highly qualified, much less likely to correlate with high probability of moving, so higher probability of staying, but positive correlation for younger, highly qualified. So that you would probably expect. Overall, we do find, so for male, young, and highly qualified as well, we have positive correlation, and old, male, low qualified, that's where there is the most negative correlation. So overall, all those probability, transition probability of moving are highly correlated with skills. More highly skilled people migrate much more and tend to leave their sort of birth area, birthplace. Right. What we did as well is did some simulation. So we took 2 regions One which is east of England, which is mostly very dominated by movements to this region. So that's sort of a host region. And then we have York and Humberside, which is mostly from, so sort of origin region. And we took those two because they've got similar population size. And what we do is that we compare the regional human capital stock with and without the regional transition adjustments. So the way we do that is in 3 steps. In first step, we just look at the net transition, and we sort of adapt those regional, the capital stock in those 2 regions. And we do find that for region 1, we would need to increase, if we were to account for transition probability, we would need to increase the human capital stocks by a factor of 1.6. In region 2, we would need to reduce it by 5.9%. And then what we add is in those the impact of this move, we add whether or we sort of make an additional assumption, which is that the move are conditioned by higher wage, and then we add as well by whether the move is conditioned by higher level of skills. And so we do find that whereas that is actually should mean that we would need to increase by 1.8% the regional human capital stock of the east of England region. We would need to decrease it for York and Humberside. Right, so this is sort of where we are. So I haven't seen much about the data we've been using. So I just quickly mentioned it at the beginning when I was thanking the ONS. So we use the UKHLS, so formerly PHPS Understanding Society, between 2009 and 2019. And of course, this is a limited. The great thing about using this data, of course, it's a panel, so you can follow the people over time and see the individual migration probabilities or moving tendency to move from one region to the next. Now, the problem is that we've quickly faced problem with sample size. And given we find that so much of the migration is happening in younger age group, we are very tempted now to try to continue expand this analysis by using the Leo analysis, where we would have, of course, far less detail on individual demographics, but we would have the performance in school and the performance on the labor market, and hopefully the tendency to migrate across the schooling years, but as well through higher or further education, and then ultimately by the choice of initial labor markets. So we hope that the Leo would sort of complement quite well what we've done so far. So that's sort of the next step where we're thinking to move this work forward. So as a conclusion, what we attempt to do is to develop more refined estimate of regional human capital stocks. We try to as well inform a bit the debate on modeling skill supplies at the regional level. This is important because of all the rebalancing agenda of the government, but as well regional inequalities has always been an interest of the people involved in this research, but as well, this is an area that draws a lot of policy interest at the moment in the UK, but I don't think only in the UK, in other countries as well. If you think of all the discussion about intergenerational inequality, this is heavily related to regional imbalances. Yes, so that's where I am. I don't know if I've been a bit too fast. Actually, probably the first person finished within time.
Thank you, Augustin. You have 1 minute left, but I'm sure we're happy to allow you to leave it there. Thank you ever so much. Excuse me. Excellent. So we have one question in the chat. Please do feel free to post your questions in the question and answer or the chat. Eugene, can I ask you to unmute and you can ask your question directly?
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering, can you expand a little bit on how you do your skills supply modeling? So what sort of data do you use? You mentioned Leo, are you using the kind of highest qualification or degree qualification, whatever?
Yeah, we would love to use Leo. Unfortunately, we haven't got access to it yet. It's only been made available very recently on the SRS at the ONS. But we're planning to be using Leo as soon as possible. So we've used the BHPS Understanding Society. So level 5, 1 to 5, 5 being graduates, 1 being a bit less than GCSE, or low grade GCSE.
Thank you. Does that answers the question? I hope, Eugene. Any other questions? I have a question or two myself. Firstly, thank you. And it's great news about Leo being available through SRS. So we're just debating how many forms that will take for us to get access, but we'll cross that bridge if we can ever get to it. One of the questions I had was, why do you think, I just wondered if I could get you to speculate a little bit around why you think wages might not be significant for the probability of moving. Have you given that much thought? And I just wondered what, how you felt about that, whether you'd got some ideas about why that might be the case.
I think in a way, by the nature of our transition probability, we do account for a lot of the usual sort of traditional reason for migration. So highly qualified, male, generally migrate a bit more internationally. It is changing now. But we account for gender and age as well. Younger people tend to migrate more. So obviously there is not much left variation in the data to be explained by wages. But generally, my experience of reading the literature on migration is it's very often quite difficult to reconcile this sort of traditional model of migration where people are income maximizer and they look very clearly at different wage in different regions, and then they pick up the region with a higher wage. It's not really happening much at all. There's much more about probability of finding a job, and that is very much conditioned by the risk. If you move to a region where you know nobody, you will need to develop maybe a social network or professional network at first before finding a job. So that's very risky. So actually, it's probably much more explained by the risk of finding the probability of finding a job in some particular region where you've got already some initial contact. So I think I'm not surprised at all. I wasn't actually expecting to find anything, but I mean, because that's, you know, the original theory, and we thought we'd do it just that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I wondered whether it was related to the fact that there wasn't a great deal of, or maybe the cost of living varies as in line with the wages, and so there was a sort of an automatic adjustment in people's minds.
Yes, very absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
Actually, if you adjust for cost of living, probably the wage differences are probably much smaller than
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. We have one more question from Sanjeev. Can you unmute and ask your question, or would you like to?
Just checking. Can you hear me, Catherine?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Carry on.
Excellent. Hi, Augustin. Just one observational comment. You're coming through very quiet and solemn. I think it might be your volume more than maybe your character. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, seriously, a couple of quick comments. Firstly, I have to put a plug in for the SRS. It's taken a long time to get various data sets in, particularly Leo. And I think also it's worth mentioning a number of other similar or related data sets are being ingested, like growing up in England. Obviously, different researchers will have different requirements, etc. So just to sort of mention that the SRS is continually expanding that area. Second thing I'd like to sort of mention is, this is an old chestnut, but I think I'm going to have to do it even more than ever before in this type of area, especially today. I would say to everyone, I'm not going to mention it again, probably, is on human capital and measurement. It's obviously got lots of challenges, lots of assumptions, limited data sources, etc. But given the different assumptions, have you or will you be doing sort of sensitivity analysis? Because when we come up with, say, conclusions, and if there's some monetary values, I always have to ask, how variable are these monetary values if you tweak the assumption? Another example is you use the same assumptions, but on a different input source data set. How does that come up? How does that change your conclusions or your estimates? And my final point is, in the mobility, and obviously through COVID particularly, and linked to house prices before COVID, mobility changes for various reasons, not necessarily with skills and job availability. So, for example, people are now going to the house of mum and dad, because the house of mum and dad in the rural areas has a garden. You can walk around. It's not on the 10th floor of a newly built tower in the centre of London or Greenwich or wherever. So house of mum and dad has got lots of things, health-wise, maybe different opportunities, but if you're working online. So where I'm coming from is, before COVID-19 and through COVID-19, obviously for me a step, there are going to be different impacts and different rationale for mobility movements. I don't know. His question is, have you considered these sort of things, or have you started to see some of this in your analysis? Thanks.
That's great. That I think there are lots of casual evidence that people have moved out of city center, going back to the house of mom and dad, or even bought housing outside of the city center for cheaper, and having a good network, internet connection is as well key there. No, we haven't. We stopped. I think the data available was initially only 19, and now it's becoming 20. But we haven't gone further than 19. I think we were a bit aware that potentially we would look at something different after 19, but I think that would be an extension that could be done quite quickly, and I think I completely agree with you. That would be super interesting to see and to follow across time. In terms of your first point, I agree as well. Yeah, I think we need to be a bit careful with what we project, so I mean, this sort of simulation exercise we presented was quite tentative. And so we would definitely be a bit careful in the way we present it, but as well, it would be great if we can sort of replicate that with another data set, the Leo. With the Leo, I think it would become, it would generate a nice dialogue between the data set, because they are really complementary, those two data. And so as I grow old, I tend to not think that there is a single data set that's going to help you answer every question, but of course there is the excitement of being able to use a new data set, and to enthusiasm linked with it, and that's great that Leo becomes available now.
Thank you both. One question in the chat, which I'll read out to you, Augustin, from Giorgio. Very interesting presentation, thank you. To follow on from my question relating to moving being more as a reason to find any job rather than necessarily the wage differences, should that translate to bigger differences between the full and employed measures of the human capital stocks, where the latter is only looking at those who are in employment?
Yes, it's a good point, Georgie. We are looking at, yes, a very good point. If it's a sort of the unused human capital, you're probably mentioning that, because of course, if it's not full, it means some human capital is out there unused. And what do you do with it if it's unused? I would say it's a potentially usable human capital, hopefully. I mean, if you think of mothers or fathers interrupting their career for a few years when they get children, hopefully this is just a temporary situation where human capital will get back in use later, and not too much underutilized, so that will not generate too many mismatches. No, agree. That's an interesting perspective. We should definitely think a bit more about, especially given employment rate varies quite a lot between different regions in the UK.
Thank you. Yes, food for thought there.
Yeah.
And Mary's just typed in to say that they can do some simulation on that point. So
yes,
might be something for the future. Interesting. Thank you ever so much. Thank you, Augustin. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, I'm going to move swiftly on to the next presenter, please. I'd like to invite Bart van Ark from the Productivity Institute, welcome, to share his screen and present his work on skills, innovation and productivity, the role of FE colleges in local and regional ecosystems. Welcome, Bart. Nice to see you. You're on mute.
Well, why not unmute myself? I was just saying hi, Kate, and thanks for having me on. And a very interesting session on a very important topic on regional issues around skills. This paper is quite different from the other papers in this session. It's actually quite different, I think, from all papers in this good seminar. And that is actually, it's not a paper. It's actually a piece of work that we are just embarking on. The Productivity Institute does a lot of different types of work. Those of you who know us, we're very broad-based. We do a lot of work on skills and human capital, but also on knowledge and on a lot of regional stuff, a lot on in the area of institutions and governance. But we also do a lot of work that's more closely related to policy as well as to business. And this project that we're embarking on, that's funded by the Gatsby Foundation, is really that sort of second piece of work, and that is how can we really better understand the role of FE colleges in trying to improve the matching of skills across regions and across local communities. We all sort of intuitively understand that FE colleges should play a critical role in this, but we also know many stories that this is not going very well, and that actually it's really difficult to do. So we, Gatsby Foundation has been funding a fair amount of work on this in the past, and we have suggested that we could follow up with some work to really try to place this whole issue of skill mismatches into the context of sort of regional and local innovation systems and what the role of FE colleges specifically could be there. So this is very much early work. So there's not a paper. We did a lot of scoping though, and a lot of discussion that I will go through this afternoon is more the scoping part of it. And I would very much be interested in suggestions and comments that you may have. Now, of course, at a very, very high level, it's obvious that there is a relationship between skills and productivity. Indeed, when you compare those two charts on the left-hand side, it's a chart from the Industrial Strategy Commission, which was produced at the time about regions that were actually growing productivity and also having higher productivity levels than the rest of the region. Those are the sort of darker red regions. And then the lighter red regions are the ones where productivity is low and has also been falling behind. On the right-hand side, you see this is not quite an old chart of 2010. It's just for illustration, but these things don't change very quickly over time, unfortunately. You see different levels of skill gaps, skill surpluses, high skill equilibrium and low skills equilibrium across different regions. If you compare the two charts, just at a sort of eyeballing aspect, you can see there is some relationship there. Although there's a lot going on in what exactly is explaining that relationship. But there was a motivation to really take a deeper dive into this relationship between skills gaps and what is happening in productivity at a regional level. So it's very well known that skill accumulation is a key driver of productivity growth. That's a direct effect. Of course, more skilled workers are more productive, but also an indirect effect, which is very important in the literature, and that is that through technological, but also more broadly organizational innovation within firms, but also between firms in a local and regional context, skills really matter for productivity growth. There's a lot of discussion about whether the skills mismatch at the regional level is worse than at an aggregate level, and sort of my hypothesis would be that at least in a sort of stationary situation, not necessarily. I think a lot of the papers that we're looking at today shows actually that there is an issue of persistence here rather than a large mismatch. And the persistence is that skill mismatches skill matches try to be locked in a sort of low level equilibrium, right? So firms adjust to the availability of skills and people adjust to the lack of demand for higher skills. But when the system becomes dynamic, so if you have a lot of technological change, as we have been seeing in the last few decades, then, of course, it's quite important that these low-level equilibria get broken, because if that's not the case, then it's very likely that regional productivity inequalities will actually increase over time, and we've seen some of that happening. Of course, if you can break this, it will allow companies to access new skills and competencies so they can raise productivity, but it will also allow workers to actually acquire those skills and competencies and make a labor market adjustment at a regional and local level possible. Now, the role of FE colleges has been a very, very long discussion. I worked at the National Institute back in the late 1980s, and we were talking about this, and it hasn't disappeared off the agenda. The UK has a very difficult past with issues around intermediate qualifications, vocational education, and technical training. Jeff Mason's last paper in 2020 is a great overview of this type of work. And a lot has been tried. Even if you look at the last 20 years, you already see a huge amount of initiatives ranging from the Centers of Vocational Excellence, national skill academies, national academies, national retraining schemes, and so forth. And all of these programs have one thing in common, and that's it. They somehow sort of pay attention to, a lip service quite often, to the need to integrate employers in this process of providing the right skills and feeding into the right demand for skills. And that's also true for the latest Skills and Jobs white paper that was published last year. There's all quite a bit of recognition, though, that further education colleges are not only playing a role when it comes to education. They can actually play a really important role more broadly in supporting business growth through innovation. I'll come back to that a little bit later in this presentation. But frankly, we have little knowledge of what works at a regional and local level. There are success stories that are gradually beginning to become clearer, but there is not a really good overview of exactly what works and what doesn't. Now, the enduring problems with the UK training model have been well described in this slide. Are a few key aspects of this. Of course, we try to think very much of this issue around training as a collective action problem that the UK is facing. That's certainly true to some extent. But some recent literature also suggests that a real problem in the UK is that there is a sort of failure of what is sort of a kind of quasi-market kind of approach to training. And Benassi's et al. Paper in the British Journal of Industrial Relations, actually a really good description of that. It was published last year. So the weak coordinating mechanisms, there are weak business associations, there are weak networks among firms at the local and regional level. And that limits, of course, the amount of employer investment that you want to do in general training. So it really goes back to sort of the old-fashioned traditional poaching story. But it also means that particular small and medium enterprises are unable to aggregate their demand skills, and are unable to share the burden, to share the cost of actually creating those kind of skills. So lack of collective action, but also the failure of these kind of quasi markets where there's some sort of competition for resources going on, isn't really showing to do having a very good effect on the issue of bringing up the skill level. The problems of sourcing skills from the school-based system are very difficult for employers. Employers find it very difficult to assess the quality of curricula. Employers face the continued government reforms that make all these qualifications quite complex and quite often opaque. And the quality is also undermined by this competitive distribution of government funds that I was already mentioning. Now, there have been repeated efforts to actually revitalize particular apprenticeship systems. The new levy was introduced in 2017 with very mixed effects of this. And also what is quite interesting is that we have seen quite not just a drop in apprenticeships, but also a change in the proportion of apprenticeships. Indeed, this chart from Batterson et al. Is indeed showing that intermediate vocational qualifications in particular have been dropping off as a percentage of overall qualifications. Higher qualifications have gone up, which is important, but it's that intermediate level that we all know is important, and especially also important for small and medium enterprises who are quite often at the receiving end of these kind of new technologies. Indeed, breaking the low skill trap is particularly hard for small and medium-sized enterprise. 70% of large employers are engaging in training, according to latest numbers, but only 27% of small and medium enterprises, 2049 employees, do so. And that's a much larger gap than what you see in most other European countries. Why is it? Well, because the training costs still seem to be excessively high. Management doesn't really dedicate the time to it, feels constrained in terms of the time that they can apply to it. There's a lack of off-the-job kind of training offers. And again, there's a sort of complexity in the training system that deters SMEs from engaging into this. 51% of SMEs are reporting problems of availability of local courses, particularly in manufacturing firms that operate in rural areas. And SMEs tend to be fairly skeptical about the role of, for example, LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, which they quite often see as helping large employers more than small employers. Now, the work by Benassi et al. Actually makes some good international comparative work, indeed showing where some of the challenges are that the UK is facing. So when you look at standards, for example, of vocational skills and training, you see it tends to be very output-based. It's quite often vaguely defined. It's poorly inspected. Whereas if you take Italy, for example, in this paper as a comparison case, tend to be more input-based. It's more detailed. There's an external assessment kind of element going on. Training providers in the UK tend to be more private, or if they're public, they tend to compete a lot amongst each other. Whereas in Italy, for example, this is primarily a public task, and there is no real sort of large role for competition in this respect. And also when you think about funding, there's a lot of tendering going in for government funding, quite often a limited amount of government funding. If you look at some of the latest programs that the VFE has provided, whereas in Italy it tends to be larger and more. A lot of the allocation tends to be done by regional and even local governments. This chart may be a little bit hard to read, but this is a similar comparison with Germany. Just focusing on the last 2 points, which I thought are quite interesting also from an innovation system point of view. And that is that networks among firms tend to be particularly weak in the case of the UK. If you compare that, for example, with Germany, where there's a lot of inter-firm training going on, and a lot of that actually being heavily subsidized by the state, quite often by the lender, by the individual federal parts of the country. And also, when you look at the engagement of business associations, that tends to be, relatively weak in the case of the UK compared to, for example, the case of Germany. There's also a much bigger picture background to this. One of the collaborators in this project is Andy Westwood from the University of Manchester. And if you look at that sort of bigger picture, you can also place it in the light of the Leveling Up program. I think Mary this morning, when she opened up, mentioned the importance of the Leveling Up program to perhaps begin to tackle some of these key issues. And the way that Andy, who recently wrote something about the role of the education system, particularly also of FE colleges in this, his view really was that the program, the Leveling Up white paper still doesn't live up to the ambitions, the amount of resources that needed, and a better policy there. Tends to be and continues to be a bit of a one-size-fits-all kind of attitude, that left behind places, that have weaker economies and weaker labor markets and lower level skills and fewer skill levels and fewer jobs and lower wages, that get the same kind of policy options to work with as the richer and more productive and higher income places. That's really what needs to be addressed. Now, the Leveling Up white paper, to do it credit, is actually making some good proposals that will help to move things forward. For example, 9 new institutes of technology, an ambition there of increasing skills with 200,000 people to get high quality training annually and 80,000 from least qualified areas. That's good. But if you think about the level of ambition, you compare it with, for example, the notion that sort of 800,000 adult learners were lost over the last decade. There's still a lot of sort of to make up for. But the problems are not just on scale and on sufficiency. The problems are also on how those skills are being utilized in local firms and in sectors and in public services, and how they're connected to other missions that are happening at a local and regional level. It's R&D and innovation and provision of good jobs and productivity. So it's not just a supply side problem. It's also something that needs to be seen in a broader framework of the demand, and that's where the skills matches really come in. So what is the new work? This is sort of, after having done this scoping, what is the new work that we're going to look at? Well, we're going to zoom in primarily on the primary role of the colleges, and that is to be at the center of trying to break that low skill equilibrium that I was mentioning before. And how can FE colleges play a larger role in this, not just in terms of supplying the skills that are needed, but also getting a better sense of what the need for skills are if technology and innovation is advancing. So trying to assess models which on how FE colleges can develop capabilities to assess critical skill needs, to create programs that really focus on a broad range of vocational skills and competencies to drive innovation and productivity. To also look at methods by which businesses can adequately determine skill and innovation needs. This is important because this is not just about FE colleges as such. It is also a recognition that actually businesses, and certainly small and medium-sized enterprises, aren't quite often that good in really identifying what the skills and the innovation needs are, particularly the skills of the future, when you have this dynamic change trying to come out of that low skill equilibrium. So we need to work much harder on how we can equip business leaders with methods by which they can try and understand what are the skills, what are the competencies that they need in order to drive their business and their innovation agenda forward. we need to understand what the role of regional and local ecosystems are in this. I'll say a few more words when closing this up, and to describe some of the pathways through which the role of ecologist in these ecosystems can be strengthened. So what are the key questions here? How can ecologists better gauge the demand for skills? What kind of capabilities do they need to translate skill requirements into curricula and flexible programs? What government interventions are most effective to facilitate the matching of demand and skills at a local level and a regional level, and how to monitor the effectiveness of these programs? The outline of the project is actually 9 months. We're just in month 2 right now, so we're very much in this early stage of reviewing the state of the art. What do we know about this at the moment? But our plan is to really begin in the next 9 months to assess the college needs and performance within an ecosystem environment much better, and identify a few specific cases. We're looking, for example, Innovation Greater Manchester, we're looking at West Midlands and Glasgow, both are participating in innovation accelerators, but also East Anglia is an interesting case with, obviously, on the one hand, the top leading university, but on the other hand, suffering from quite a few innovation deficiencies in areas across that region. In the next phase, we're hoping to really dive a little bit more deeper into how ecologists exactly interact with the business community within those ecosystems, and what kind of policy interventions and evaluations can really work. Where I want to close up is really with, we're doing some of this work in collaboration with the Innovation Caucus, particularly with Tim Worley from Oxford Brookes, who has been thinking along similar lines around the role of ecologists in regional ecosystems, but a little bit more broadly, not just around providing skills and assessing the demand for skills, but more broadly, how ecologists can play a role in an innovation ecosystem, and play a central role, actually, for local and regional businesses to be a critical part of this. And as part of this work, he's been developing some sort of a logic model of how FECs can advance business innovation. So what are the outcomes that you really want to achieve in an innovation ecosystem? Improving infrastructure, improving the quality of the workforce, business growth. You could actually replace that by productivity growth, if you like, and collaboration. But at the left end, you also have the issue of the inputs, the resources that are needed, that I mentioned a little earlier in relation to Andy Westwood's work in this project. But also what kind of activities and outputs can ecologists really get involved with. And you can even dive a little bit deeper in that work and look at specific areas of infrastructure, of collaboration type of activities, and so on and so forth. So I know that I'm hitting my 20 minutes, and I see Kate putting on her screen, so that's good. So finally, some of the really difficult questions that are very hard to answer. But there are big questions about what kind of career pathways will really motivate young people to get out of this low-level skills equilibrium. How can we deal with some of the inequalities in the school-to-work transition issue? Particularly gender and ethnicity issues are playing a big role. How might businesses give greater visibility and value to a variety of lifelong learning? This important issue about where do we need to be here on the spectrum of collaboration versus competition. The issue that I mentioned of the dysfunctionality of quasi-markets. So how far do we need to go to collaboration? Where is this going to be fruitful and helpful? Should ecologists primarily focus on the supporting existing and established businesses, or should it also get more involved with creation of new startups? And last but not least, what is there still to be learned from other countries and regions in other countries in terms of things that we can do better? So Kate, let me stop there, and happy to take any question or comments, I hope in particular, to move this work forward.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Bart. That's really exciting stuff. There's a question from Sanjeev. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you'd be very welcome to pose the question directly.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, Bart. That last slide, I think you've definitely set yourself a really challenging program there. And if you can answer those questions in the timescale, I must say, I'm very impressed. I mean, that's a hell of a lot there. So a couple of quick questions. this ever-changing world, why just the FE colleges focus? What about the other training and learning type establishments, whether it's Open University, whether it's specific business schools? There's lots of variety of learning and development. So what about the other arena? Because the FE is not just the only soul. And then also the impact of these courses, online courses, YouTube learning, because obviously education now doesn't have to be physical in the classroom, even if it's in colleges, etc. You've got academies, but the online dimension is changing learning quite a lot. And people are putting together, for example, YouTube videos, which form courses. Like this might be 5 videos forming a course. And that learning often is also free. You don't have to pay for it. So the impact of free learning. And then ultimately, what is, I think, the quality of training? How do you measure that? How relevant it is? Because if we're training people for skills that don't really exist or they're in decline, there's, as much as that training is great, we're training people not to be able to do what they want to do because those posts or jobs are in decline. But other skills, so for example, artificial intelligence, web design, software, there's lots of new learning required to fulfill the skills requirements where there's shortages in these type of developing roles. So it's matching that as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Great questions. And first of all, I think I mentioned a few names during my presentation, but I want to give very specific credit to Andy Westwood, to Damien Grimshaw at King's, and Tim Vorley at Oxford Brookes, because this is really kind of joint work, which in a way makes it exciting because we come into this from very different perspectives, and I think that's going to be helpful in doing this work. I think your point is well taken on should we just focus on FE colleges? The reason why we did is that we were really thinking right away from the perspective of an entity at a local and regional level that is there, that exists, and that seems not fully integrated into the ecosystem as a whole. So in a very describing it in a very unusual way, you would basically say, I mean, that sometimes it's just seen as churning out some people with some intermediate type of qualification, or just people who can't do higher education and just end up there. And that's really an underrating of the importance of FE colleges. There's resources going into it. The building is there, the entity is there. And if you think of the importance of innovation and regional local and regional innovation systems for productivity, you need to give a very central role to these kind of colleges. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not other ways for people to acquire skills. You're absolutely right. Online skills become increasingly important. And it is definitely something that goes into the mix. And frankly, FE colleges probably need to get better in making really good use of that for the people who come through these FE colleges themselves. So it's not one way or another. But what we do believe is that there is just so much scope for FE colleges sitting already in that sort of local and regional area to play a much more critical part. So that's why we started focusing on that. But your points are very well taken, that there's a good way of involving other types of training into this, certainly online. Now, on the quality, what is good quality? This, I think, really comes ultimately to the question whether demand and supply match, right? So once businesses have a good understanding of what their needs are, and once FE colleges have a good understanding on how they can supply those needs and how they can work together to figure that out, that I think is really what we're looking for. That will determine the high quality of a training program, is that you actually try to resolve these matches and that you get out of that low-level equilibrium. So, that's not a very specific definition of this, but I think that's what we need to look for in this work.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you, Sanjeev, for the question. Augustin, you have a question, I believe.
Yeah, Bart. Well, actually, I really like you focus on further education. Sorry, Sanjeev. One thing that came to my mind is, how do further education college decide on generating a new course? I don't know, if I reason as we do at university, we basically ask some marketing company to look what's the demand for a course we have in mind, and then we just launch it through the bureaucratic process, the uni, and just pray that you've got enough students applying to your course. Now, for me, the further education college, I've been working in apprenticeship for quite a while. It's still very much a black box. Have they got any? Are they talking to employers? How they do it? Is it just the employer with the biggest mouth who just say, come to the further local college and say, look, come on, create this new course, where actually there are far more demands for other employers who are not big mouth? Is there any structure in there, in the further education college, that could allow them to sort of assess better where the demand would be for new courses? And I was thinking of what Nesta presented us this morning. It sounds to me like the instruments are there nearly, because, I mean, I don't know what you think of. Are you going to speak to further education directors, or are you already speaking with them?
Yes, no. Well, first of all, that's I very quickly skipped through our plan, but in this first phase, there's a series of interviews with people in FE colleges, but also outside FE colleges, because I do think the key hypothesis here is that they're not in a good place when it comes to, for them, understanding what I need to offer and how to offer it. So I think you're exactly right. I think they're in between the difficulty to actually develop new programs and new curricula. That's something that doesn't happen overnight. You need the right people for that. You need to have the right permissions for that, and all those kind of things. It takes time to build new curricula, as we all know very well, any one of us involved in education. So that's a difficult place to be, particularly in an environment where the technology tends to become more dynamic and changing very rapidly over time. And we know from any kind of apprenticeship system, including the best working ones in the world, like Germany and Switzerland, that actually changing the curriculum in apprenticeships is really difficult and really hard to do. So that's a challenge. But at the other end, you're exactly right. There is a risk that it becomes completely ad hoc. You know, whether it is the employer with the big mouth, or whether it's just who happens to be sitting on the board of the regional economic, innovation system, or who the leaders in the FE colleges happen to be connected with. So there's a huge risk that you get false information about what the real skill needs is. In addition to the point that I mentioned earlier, there's quite a bit of evidence that it is really hard for employers to define skills more precisely.
Yes.
To translate them into competencies. You know, that's very difficult to do. And you need to so the point of these innovation systems is that you bring together a group as large as possible, that you try to have systematic methods to understanding the needs, to play them back to the employers, to really understand that this is what that I agree or not agree, that is what I need, and then begin to build programs around it. And a lot of that doesn't start right away with curricula. It starts with, workplaces at companies, and match it with existing programs, and then gradually see if you want to build that into a more systematic program. All of this, though, needs a longer term focus, and all of it needs not kind of short-term funding projects of a few months. It needs a longer term commitment. And you see that the colleges, also in the UK, that have been successful in it for quite a few years already. And I think that is probably already a sign of what's going on here.
Thank you. One last very quick question, Mary, and then we're done. You've got to be quicker, Mary. Are you on mute?
There she is.
I'm on mute now. You hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is really crucial here, going back to what Sanjeev was talking about, is the FE colleges will be constrained by the group of people that they can attract as students, and the quality of that intake is going to depend very much on the quality of the schools in the local regions. And I think this is something that, in the long run, it's something we have to look at as well, not just what the colleges offer, but also the intake, because a lot of people go to higher education in this country. About 50% of the young people go to higher education. And it's the kind of choice of those people. In some ways, that's the optimal choice. And so you do have to look at this whole spectrum, even though I agree that FE college is very important. You do need to ultimately look at the broad spectrum.
Yeah, and I think you want the entire education system to be represented in that ecosystem structure, and you're absolutely right. It starts in kindergarten, and that's where you try to get kids interested and trying to understand their academic skills as they develop over time, and their interests as well. And that's why companies and schools, even at the very primary school level, start to working together to get kids to understand what the opportunities are and send them in the right direction. But and when we look at the very first chart in my presentation, the amount of areas that we have in the UK and in many other countries of these low-skill trap areas, you can only get out of that if you start early on. And if you don't start early on, you can have as much technological change as you want, but you won't get out of that trap. So you're absolutely right. It needs to start with showing kids very early on what the opportunities are and improving the quality of education system to have kids to begin to understand where their educational future is going to be. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. Sorry, one last comment. This all has to be linked. Schooling to FE to university, and we're just very bad at doing that because none of these institutions talk to each other. Very little.
But the truth is that I keep saying this, being a little bit looking outside in a little bit. This is not just a UK problem. I agree. There seem to be reasons to think it's particularly bad in the UK. I would agree with that. But these challenges on how these different types of education systems work together is incredibly difficult. There is a lot of evidence, though, that if you decentralize this, if you let them work together at local and regional level, you are much more likely to get successes than if you try to centralize that all, because that's not the way to incentivize these schools to really do that.
Thank you both. That's really interesting. I've got so many directions that could go in, but thank you Bart for your time today. Tremendously interesting. Can I finally ask Andrés Gvirtz from the University of Cambridge to share his screen and present his work on regional personality differences across Great Britain. Please, Andrés.
Okay, the unmute button was on the other screen. It's a big pleasure being here today. So my name is Andrés Gvirtz. I'm a personality psychologist. Personality in the econ literature would normally be called non-cognitive skills. And I basically study the intersection of the non-cognitive skills / personality. So basically who we are and where we are. So to start a bit with who we are, how do we actually conceptualize this in economics? I'm just quickly making sure, is the actual presenter screen being shared?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, perfect. So if we would just look at my own personality test, it would tell that in one of the core concepts in personality psychology, openness to new experience, I score in the highest 99th percentile. The other thing that you would, however, see if you would look at, for example, my credit card history, is that I spent too much money at Nero. And obviously I seem to enjoy the products, but the one complication is that the little door you see next to the coffee shop is actually my entry door. So I live right above the store, and everyone in my house seems to have the same preference for that Italian-inspired coffee store. So the research question kind of arose, is the neighborhood I decided to call home maybe related to my personality, or rather to the social amenities around us? So how can we actually capture personality? The main construct used are the so-called Big Five. The first one is neuroticism. We can always conceptualize it also by the opposite. So neuroticism is the tendency to be rather anxious, depressed, vulnerable. The opposite of it would be to be very emotionally stable. It's important to note people are not binary on them, but those are scales between extremes that fairly follow a normal distribution. The second one is extraversion versus introversion. It's not just can you speak in front of people, it's also like, are you assertive? Do you like external stimuli activity? The third one is openness versus closeness to experience. Openness is kind of the idea. There's different facets, but do you like arts? Do you like culture? Do you like to engage with novel things? Agreeableness then has a bit of trust, compliance, also tender-mindedness. And the last one is conscientiousness, which is like how ordered, how structured are you? They've been used to predict a variety of light outcomes, from like personal, interpersonal relationships to external outcomes such as job successes. Been used, for example, to explain the Brexit vote. And there's even small but robust links to things such as life expectancy. Just to conceptualize them, if we think, for example, about relationship outcomes, the results would tell us that in general, to worry very much, so neuroticism would be negatively related with a positive relationship outcomes, while being agreeableness, being able to basically have compromises, is positively related with relationship outcomes, while university results or any academic results are mainly about conscientiousness, about being ordered, structured, and following plans. Now, the interesting thing is that those differences, they don't only differ between people, they actually differ within countries. And the first work showed this on a US state level, but since then we've gotten much, much more granular. So the second map you're seeing in the UK was done through a major cooperation with the BBC, where over 500,000 people participated in the personality survey. And interestingly, for this room, all of this data is geotagged because people told us where they're actually living. Since then, it's also been shown that there's like distinct areas, even in smaller countries such as Switzerland. If now, however, we think about much of the things that we're interested in, so for example, to go back to the first picture, the link with the manatees, they actually happen within cities. And we also have strong evidence that there's actually spatial aggregation of personality within a city. So here you see the figures for London, with red indicating that on average people score high on that tray, blue that they score low. And we see, for example, that the city center of London attracts very open people who at the same time score very low in agreeableness. And this is likely due to being a lot of young, internationally educated and diversity-seeking people in London, who at the same time are very career-driven and therefore low in agreeableness on average. So why do we believe that those differences exist? There's a lot of drivers, a lot of them socioeconomic literature. From the geographic psychological literature, there's further three pathways. The first one being ecological influence, the idea that features of the environment might actually have an influence on psychological phenomena. The second one, also I think extremely important within the economics literature, the idea of selective migration. People migrate not only because of economic reasons, but also to spaces that just might satisfy and reinforce their needs. Kind of person-environment fit is, I think, here the big related topic too. And the third one is social influence. So people with communities have an influence on norms and on our individual behavior. We can easily imagine that if we think about extroversion, introversion, based on how your society, if they rather value individualized versus communal values, outcomes here might differ. So coming from this framework that we're going to apply across three studies that I shortly want to present to you today, we think that there's those drivers that will lead to spatial personality differences. And as an ex-consultant, I always care about the so what. So kind of the second order effects, why should we care about it? So let's actually look at it. To relate amenities and so like the offerings in an area and who actually lives there, we used a very large scale survey conducted in cooperation with the BBC that I just mentioned. We had around 100,000 participants within the first 2 days and over 500,000 in total. Of these, around 430,000 filled out all the personality questionnaire as well as gave us the information required to geotag the information. From those 430,000 participants, around 60,000 live in London, so that we are able to have average personalities for different neighborhoods in London. To get information on amenities, we accessed Yelp, which is a platform such as TripAdvisor, in which users can rate and review everything from food stores to pet stores. And I believe Yelp is really an underutilized research tool. It is accessible in an automated manner. For London alone, we have around 50,000 locations, And the thing that makes the research really kind of neat and straightforward is that Yelp pre-clusters all different amenities in 22 categories. And just to give you some example, there's, for example, the food category that includes things such as bagels, donuts, farmer markets. It's a bit more casual category. There would also be a restaurant category with a bit more formal places. There's an arts category, including everything from like jazz locations to opera houses. Yeah, so now we kind of have our location, we have our amenity, and now we need control variables. And we include here, of course, age, and we include here the indices of deprivation. The main reason we use the indices of deprivation, which capture, I believe it was 5 categories. For example, like the percentage of children, adults eligible for social services rather than a pure income measure. Because if we think about London, we have a lot of students in London who, if we use a pure income-based approach, would all be probably quantified in the lowest quintile income-wise. I think it would be very unreasonable to assume that students are the poorest and most deprived in the area. So rather we use the income deprivation. The problem that we have, and I'm not going to go too much about it, I just thought it might be relevant for some people here in the audience, so I just wanted to mention it, is that the data normally does geographically not match. And that means whenever we do a survey, we ask people about which postal code do they live in, because I'm trained in spatial econometrics and psychology and geographic psychology, and I have no idea which kind of spatial unit I live in under MSOA, OSA, or any of the units used actually by the ONS and all of the statistical work that is being conducted. So we always have to ask people for the postal codes, but they don't actually overlap. So together with some spatial econometrists, we developed the method that basically just overlaps areas to reweigh them and calculate them. We're about to also release like a software that automizes all of this. But if this sounds interesting for any of you, think, hey, I have a project, just send me an email afterwards, and I'm happy to have another use case for the product. So the takeaway from this, however, is now that we have on the same spatial map, we have all the personality profiles, and we actually have the Yelp locations. So what do we actually see? We see now that, maybe just quickly talking here about the model. What you're seeing here are conditional random forests. They're basically a non-parametric machine learning method that ranks the variable according to the ability to predict a dependent variable. In this case, that's openness. Using conditional random forest means we do not have a direct score, but we have the variable importance. And they're especially important for our line of work because of 2 main reasons. And the first one is kind of the large p small n problems, when you have a small sample but many control variables. And while we started with a huge sample, it got minimized very quickly. And we have 400 participants in one postal code is now just one observation. And secondly, the model is unaffected by nonlinearity, and most important, works well if the variables have a high correlation with each other. And clearly our 22 Yelp categories have a high relationship with each other. So this is kind of an alternative approach to reducing dimensionality. So looking at the results, we see that the best predictors is what kind of makes sense. It's like food, restaurants is the more formal version. It's also arts, things that we intuitively would have expected for openness to new experience to be related to it. Now you might wonder, okay, we have this fancy models, we have a lot of categories, wouldn't you always find something? And we ran also just on the background, we ran also spatial autocorrelation models and all of this, and our results are consistent across model choices. But for me, the most convincing argument here is that for some amenities, there is no reason we would expect any relationship, and we don't. So things as the number of ATMs captured in the financial categories does not predict local openness to new experiences, and I really can't see a reason it really should. And other categories such as density of order shops does neither once we control for population density. So further, there are, however, some personality traits where we really wouldn't expect to be able to predict them at all from the density of local amenities. And one of them is conscientiousness. And the interesting thing is we are unable to do so. So we see here the only significant predictor are control variables such as age and comprehensive income controls. Yeah. So this is kind of the first study. Are there any imminent questions about the first study? Otherwise, we can also talk of it, of course, at the end.
No questions posed. Thanks. So
okay,
perfect.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Okay, so the second study is actually by a couple of colleagues of mine, but I thought it might be really relevant to the room, so I wanted to show it. Basically, what they looked at is at the largest scale personality survey that exists for the US, where we have 2 million geotagged participants. And the survey was conducted through a lot of years. So what they actually did is they checked for which cities do we have in every year at least 100 participants, and they identified 199 cities where they would have a total of 8,000 participants per city. And what we done run was the panel vector autoregressions to understand how might the change in housing cost be related to a change in openness. We now see kind of intuitively just by the plot that there seems to be a relationship, but let's actually dive a bit into it. They employed panel vector autoregressions to kind of, because the causality, the direction also wasn't completely clear. Might rising housing costs lead to more openness, or might more openness lead to higher rising costs? And so basically here, both directionalities are checked, and each variable is predicted by its own lagged values and the lagged values of other variables, as well as an error term. Practically meaning we can just simultaneously test whether housing prices predict openness and vice versa. And as you can now see on the model on the left, when we do this, we find that while housing costs predict openness longitudinally, openness does not predict housing cost, controlling for population density and city level demographics. And on the upper right panel, we now see that if housing costs rise by 1 unit, and in the case of that study, 1 unit corresponds to $50, which is the common occurrence on the US housing market, city level openness also rises by 0.17 standard deviation in the year after that. And this is a quite strong effect within our line of work. In contrast now, however, we see that in the lower panel that if openness rises by 1 standard deviation, there's no change in city level housing prices in the following. And now that we kind of know that rising housing prices prompted an upward shift in city level openness, they try to disentangle the underlying process a bit more. And to do so, they used an additional survey from the same data set, which actually asked participants how long they lived at their place of residence. Then the data was split depending on whether participants had moved since 2006 when the study began. And those who stayed in the same place throughout the study were now treated as established population, whereas those who had moved since 2006 were treated as newcomers. And the idea here is that if selective migration is at play, we should find the effect among newcomers. And if sociocultural adaptation is at play, then we should find the effect among established residents. As you can see here in the displayed like impulse response functions, is that in these models, housing prices predicted openness both among the established residents in the upper panel, which is in line with the sociocultural adaptation, and among newcomers, that is the lower panel, which is in line with selective migrating. Meanwhile, as before, rising openness had no effect on housing prices in either group. So one thing is that we should take this a bit with a pinch of salt, because the classification was a bit unspecific. People might have moved within the city, so there's some limitations to the work. At the same time, I chose this study to show you today because I think it provides an important first step into highlighting novel ways to closer look into causal and also disentangling the processes that might underlie differences we see through those non-cognitive factors. Yeah, so as a third study, I quickly wanted to show you something also from the political sphere. And the framework we're using here, sorry, was there a question, Catherine? Or?
No, just you've got about 2 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the third study, it's actually, I just want to show you something very brief here, is that we normally understand behavior as a function of person, so who is there and the environment. And we try to apply this to the COVID pandemic, again, through a large-scale data collection in collaboration with newspapers. We had over 100,000 participants representing 55 countries. So what did we find? The interesting thing here first is we see stringency. So this is using from Oxford the stringency index, how in a time-adjusted model again, is really indicative here. So countries which had more stringency, people sheltered more at home. So this was what we were studying. Do people shelter at home, yes or no? Interestingly, we also see, for example, people who are more extroverted sheltered less at home, which kind of makes sense. People who seek more the external stimuli, they had a harder job. More neurotic people, people who were more worried, stayed at home. They were concerned about catching and transmitting coronavirus independent of the routes. So as a last thing, what we wondered is, was there maybe an interaction of stringency and personality? And what you see here is the dark blue line shows the participants at the time they took the survey were in countries with strong government measures. The light blue dotted line shows the participants at the time were in countries with weak government measures. And you see that overall openness to experience was related to sheltering in place. But once the governments get stricter, more people stay at home. So the effect of personality on staying at home decreased as government got more stringent. And for neuroticism, this interaction is even stronger. Neurotic people tend to shelter at home at a higher rate, but government stringency will eclipse kind of most of the effect. So the important thing, if we look at those factors, such as the non-cognitive ones, such as personality here, they depend on the situation. So all of this, of course, wouldn't have been possible without a long list of wonderful collaborators. Also, most of the data we're working here, we're actually now working on making it publicly accessible. So if there's anything you saw could be interesting for your work, as you see, there's just one face missing to make this matrix really neat looking. So feel free to send me a message afterwards.
Thank you, Andre. That's brilliant. Thanks very much. I have one question in the chat.
Absolutely.
And if anyone else has any questions, please do post them in the chat. We have some time. Excellent. So question from Giorgio. I'm going to read it out. There is a strong literature on the correlation between various personality traits and labour market outcomes. But for interventions and skills policy, I'm interested in what you know about development and changes of personality traits, and if so, are there any regional differences in such interventions?
Yeah, so the answers depends a bit on the first and second is a bit different. So you're completely right. There's a lot of literature on it. The bit neat thing about personality is that it stays quite constant throughout the lifetime. So there's certain events that, for example, will make people more neurotic. Unemployment is a big one, which kind of makes sense. If you worry a lot, it's likely that you're becoming more neurotic. These effects from, I would have to revisit the literature to be 100% sure, but as far as I remember, these effects also don't directly reverse. So it's not that like a person gets employment and their score might directly, kind of the issue resolves by itself. As far as I know, I'm not aware of any intervention work that takes geographic differences into account, but it's definitely something that should be done. I think the main reason why we haven't seen it as much is just we didn't used to have any geographic data sets with like fine grain, because this was only possible because of kind of the advent of like social media and online studies that allowed us to get, for example, the largest now in the US is nowadays 3.5 million participants. This allows us to be fine-grained social. This was impossible until before. So the first picture that I showed, which I think is one of the first works around 2006, that was on US state level. And now we start to get into actually looking at counties, or in the example here at 200 cities.
Wow, thank you. That's interesting. I have another question here from Sanjeev. I'm going to give him the option to open his mic and ask you directly.
Thanks, Andrés. Can I just check? You can hear me, Catherine?
Yeah.
Good.
I double check because sometimes the networks are not always on top form. I love this sort of presentation because it's got a massive dose of subjectiveness. You're not right or wrong. I'm not right or wrong, and neither will be Catherine right or wrong. But it's great Friday evening discussion with a glass of wine or two or three. So first thing is linked to Georgi's point. Do you allow for, in your calibration and your assessment, actual versus perception on personality evaluation? For example, I might consider myself, as many people might do, I hope, I'm quite shy, quiet, and introverted. But would some evaluation confirm that in terms of, again, the actual versus the perception? Second theme I've got is there are different features in life that mean different things to people, implying what generates the source of happiness or discontent, as the case may be. So money doesn't make everyone happy, but it gives you freedom of choice. Excess salary doesn't make you happy, it changes your mindset to a degree. So if I look at the last 3 or 4 years, the Scandinavian countries in particular, but Finland has been holding the happiest people in the world sort of title, or whatever it is, of that ilk. And people value safety and peace and areas of non-violence, but it's not necessarily money. It may be the clean environment, it may be food types. If I'm in the middle of Asia with fresh pineapple and fruits off trees, that's going to make me happier than having tinned stuff or supposedly fresh stuff from Tesco. So it's the ingredients and what makes people happy. It's interesting to know if you do some international analysis. I can understand the rural city analysis, but maybe how does Finland achieve that and the UK doesn't? I had one other point actually, is the interlinkages. So yeah. For example, I go to the ATM and it's not working and I don't get the extra £50 I need. I can't get onto the taxi to get to Regent's Park to watch the open air theatre show and have a pre-meal somewhere. So I'm not happy I don't have a meal. I'm not happy I don't see the show. But actually, my unhappiness is at the ATM. On the other hand, if I get my £50, the ripple effect is huge. So do you do anything in your calibration of like the linkages of what might be viewed as not that important, but has a big impact on your happiness and the personality sort of satisfaction? Right.
To first answer the first one, it's a very common question, and I think it's one of the things where personality is actually very, very reliable. So the idea, if I self-assess the personality, if I fill out the survey myself, how valid is it? Just as a note, so basically, if you yourself take the survey today and you take it in 3 months, we would expect like an inter-item correlation of around 0.8. If you now ask an external rater to rate who is this person, so somebody who knows you very well, it's around 0.7, so just minimally worse than your, oh, I think you're muted, Catherine. Okay, yeah, so just minimally worse than the inter-item validity. The thing I actually gave it to my partner, and she took the question as if she would be answering them for me, and the highest deviation she had was 2 percentile for any question, which I found, like I teach the psychometric class, but I still found it impressive to kind of see it on myself, that like with my partner ranking me, that the deviation was only 2 percentiles, which is a deviation I would expect by just taking the survey repeatedly. So I think that is something we don't have to worry as much. And there's been a lot of research of teachers rating the students, parents rating the students. And around personality, it's more accurate. If we would go to values, it would be a bit less accurate because then people might show different faces to different people. For the second point, so one thing that I think here about, does the cross-cultural work, but I think also the geography even has different effect on different people. But the one study that just sparks to my mind is by Sandra Mutch at CBS. And what she basically did is she looked, can we explain spending through credit card history above and beyond by not looking only at an individual's personality, but by looking at the personality of the people around them. And what she basically found is that when the people were around you were more outgoing and all of this, you would also be spending more money on those activities, even if they actually don't match your personality. So even if the person environment fit isn't really there, your surrounding will still influence you. And I mean, we can think about this on different levels. And I think country level might be one, person level is another. And yeah, the ripple effects, I think those are like situation. We would hope that just if we have enough, that as personality is rather stable across time, if we think more about it as a trait than as a state, that this would average out. But the environment definitely has an influence that goes beyond the individual. I hope this answers it a bit.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And everyone's been beautifully behaved, and we have about 30 seconds until the official end of the session. So if there's any last minute questions, but if not, thank you so much for your engagement this afternoon. Thanks to all of our speakers for this session, and indeed the earlier ones. Today we have we will now have a 30-minute break for afternoon tea before we commence our final panel session on skills measurement for policy research and research use. So thank you ever so much to all of our speakers and to everyone. Thank you.